Okay, Vimo, can we begin? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Nick Larigakis. I'm president of the American Hellenic Institute. And on behalf of our AHI, nonprofit Greek American think tank and public policy center, it is a pleasure to present our first virtual speakers forum of 2023 with two expert panelists who will examine the topic, the Eastern Mediterranean in the crosshairs, the opportunity and challenges for U.S. foreign policy. Doug Bandow, who is a senior fellow at Cato Institute and a familiar face to AHI audiences, and Michael Rubin, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, each are highly respected foreign policy analysts, and we look forward to hearing their perspectives on today's topic. As such, our briefing today promises to be insightful. We will examine how the Biden administration's approach to Eastern Mediterranean policy has been viewed in Washington, Athens, and Nicosia, most notably the proposed arms sales to Turkey and the 3+1 framework. And will there be any changes to it as we continue into 2023? Greece and Cyprus continue to take measures to strengthen their relations with the United States while addressing their own foreign policy challenges, some of which are mutual, including Turkey's provocations, and include the year-long war in Ukraine. And we will get our panelists' take on developments that may impact diplomacy in the Eastern Mediterranean, such as the tragic, devastating earthquake in southern Turkey, elections in Cyprus that yielded a new president in Nikos Christodoulidis, and pending elections in Greece and Turkey this coming spring. U.S.-Greece relations are all-time high. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Athens in February in support of the fourth strategic dialogue underscores this deepened cooperation across all sectors. An upgraded mutual defense cooperation agreement and recently enacted legislation that bolsters investment in the relationship has sustained the flourishing relationship. Finally, in addition to being a valued security partner, Greece is an important player in international commerce, shipping, and trade. Unfortunately, Greece's foreign policy and security hurdles remains thanks largely to its hostile neighbor, Turkey. Turkey's acts of provocation and aggression seems endless. The multiple egregious violation of Greece's sovereign airspace, 22,000 alone in 2022, and waterways contributes to instability in the region. And illegal migrant flows from Turkey continue to be a concern. These acts continue even as the crisis in Europe rages in Ukraine. We have seen a timeout in tensions amid earthquake solidarity and Erdogan's needs to focus domestically because of the earthquake's destruction. Although welcomed, continue to call me a skeptic. In the end, Turkey remains, in my opinion, a failed NATO partner. Amid all of this, Greece, a frontline state in a fight against terrorism, remains an invaluable contributor to the United States, EU, and NATO security interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Greece is a key contributor through European Union and NATO apparatuses to the defense of democracy and freedom in Ukraine. Greece is home to America's most important naval presence in the Mediterranean Sea at Souda Bay, Crete, and Alexandroupolis is recognized as a port city with increased geostrategic importance and referred to as the Souda of the North. Cyprus is a proven strategic partner of the U.S. like Greece. Cyprus relations with the United States continue to strengthen, especially in defense and security cooperation. Since last year, Cyprus Center for Land Operations, Seas, and Port Security, so-called Cyclops, an innovative security site partially funded by the United States, has opened. Furthermore, the United States fully lifted its arms prohibition on Cyprus in October of 2022. However, it is an action that must be reviewed annually by the administration. While an important step, the administration must permanently lift its arms prohibition on Cyprus. Regarding efforts to achieve a Cyprus settlement, Turkey's continued insistence on antiquated, obstructive, and unacceptable stances persist and are not productive. Turkey's illegal reopening of the beach in Varosha, history of illegal activities in Cyprus's exclusive economic zone, and President Erdogan's open declaration for support of a two-state solution on Cyprus is a violation of international law and United Nations resolutions, and all undermine efforts to resume Cyprus settlements talks. AHI contends there must be a larger condemnation of the division of Cyprus by the United States and international community. Now allow me to present our two panelists today, a brief bio on each one, and then we'll start off with Doug. Doug Bandow is a senior fellow at Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He also worked as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. He writes regularly for leading publications such as Fortune Magazine, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. Doug Bandow speaks frequently at academic conferences, on college campuses, and to business groups. He has been a regular commentator on ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and NBC. He holds a Juris Doctorate degree from Stanford University. Michael Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. A former Pentagon official, Dr. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and both pre- and post-war Iraq. For more than a decade, he taught classes at sea about the Horn of Africa and the Middle East conflicts, culture, and terrorism to deployed U.S. Navy and Marine units. He's the author and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shiite politics. He has a PhD and an MA in history from Yale University, and he also has a BS in biology. So we welcome them here today. And without further ado, we'll get right into our panelists. And as I said, we will start off with my good friend, Doug Bandow. The Zoom floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Nick. It's a great pleasure to join you and Michael on this panel. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. An awful lot's going on in the world, obviously. We look around us and we see war in Ukraine. We see potential war in East Asia over Taiwan. We see Iran moving forward with a nuclear program. We see North Korea building more nukes and missiles. So there's an awful lot that has people on edge. And it's very important not to lose sight of the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean. That I think it's easy for people to focus on a lot of these other issues and perhaps not pay as much attention as they should. Nevertheless, if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially the role of Turkey, there are a lot of very important issues there, some of which intersect with some of these other major concerns that we have. I mean, the Eastern Med is more than a vacation spot. That it's an important crossroads geographically and economically. It's of historic importance, obviously, for Europe and Asia, and it's clearly very important today. If you look at the issues that are out there, one can look, for example, at the Balkans and the Black Sea. The question of control of access, how that plays into not just the war with Ukraine, but also getting food and fertilizer and other products to people around the world. Energies, all of those are tied up with that issue. This kind of ties in with a broader sense of NATO and Russia. And this even reaches up to Finland and Sweden, which are affected, ironically, by Turkey in terms of a willingness to allow them to join. North Africa remains obviously a security concern. It's also an economic issue. We still have a civil war that at least their divisions are very serious in Libya, a country that remains utterly unstable and divided. That this has drawn in many countries across Europe, America's allies, also from the Middle East, an awful lot of instability there. One looks at Israel. Israel has relationships, very important ones, with Cyprus and Greece. It plays a role with energy. It's also a security concern, obviously, for the United States. And, we see the Middle Eastern issues through Turkey reaching Lebanon. They reach into Syria. They reach Iran. All of these get tied up into really kind of going back to the Eastern Mediterranean. And what you see in this region, unfortunately, is an enormous amount of instability and uncertainty. And when we think of opportunities and challenges, the irony is that almost all of them are affected to a great degree by Turkey. And it's very hard for any presidential administration these days, and especially the Biden administration, to try to move forward on these issues without dealing with the reality of Turkey. And we certainly have to ask whether it really is an ally or not. I think the problem is, if you look at issue after issue, it's quite problematic. And we've seen problems in the past in terms of its role in Syria, for example, at one point working, it appeared, with ISIS and attacking the Kurds with whom the U.S. fought against ISIS. Very clearly, as you mentioned, the issues of Greece and Cyprus, where you have a NATO country, Turkey, threatening to go to war against a NATO ally, Greece, interfering with energy development. I mean, occupying a country that's in the European Union. This creates its own set of instability. It has a very real impact on Greece's military preparedness. Greece has to respond to these multiple violations of its territorial air and sea, which of course draws money away from better uses for defense funds in terms of its own security and dealing with Russia and other threats in the region. I mean, at one point, the Turks were even threatening France over naval issues in the Eastern Med and bringing arms to Libya. Israel once had a very good relationship with Turkey. That has gone very badly. So what you see in all of these issues is, ironically, Turkey, a member of NATO, is threatening the interests of NATO members, of Europeans, of allies of these countries. And I think it's a particular concern today that where the US and the Europeans are quite committed to the defense of Ukraine against Russia, Turkey could play a positive role in that, but in fact it hasn't. Turkey has played a double game very carefully, not allowed NATO ships into the Black Sea, allowing sanctions busting and flights from Russia. Its engagement in Syria, working with Russia, also threatening Kurdish allies. And we have the overarching problem that remains of their purchase of S-400s, the fact it's much harder to cooperate militarily with Turkey when it has Russian arms, Russian weapons within its own system. So what we see here then is a very real undermining of American and allied interests. So I'd say in that sense, Turkey provides us with a much greater challenge than it does, unfortunately, opportunities. And these are all issues that this administration is trying to deal with. And it's tried to deal with it, I think, in many ways, the way administrations have in the past, which is trying to get past the reality of Turkey. That is, trying to treat it as just a slightly and perhaps misbegotten ally, where if only the U.S. provides, F-16s as opposed to F-35s, maybe things will be okay, that one can purchase the votes of Erdogan, hopefully in this case, without confronting the issue of its membership in NATO, and whether in effect it's a fifth column. That is, can one trust Turkey in the one kind of scenario one would imagine NATO really being needed for, which is fighting Russia? If a war like that occurred, could Turkey be relied on? And the problem we face, a lot of people hope that we just get past Erdogan and now all the opportunities will come. Well, one can hope for that. And there's an election this year in May. We'll see whether it's an honest election and what comes out of that. The problem is those around him who might try to replace him are not friends of America. And even the public of Turkey tends to be very antagonistic towards the US and Western Europeans. What we see, if you look at where they stand, the popularity of America is very low in a country like Turkey. So there's a long-term issue here, a country that has really gone very far from genuine democracy, which is going to have a lot of trouble, I think, getting back, even if the opposition wins. Can it take firm control? Can it rebuild institutions? All of these are issues it's going to be dealing with. And we can't assume that they're going to put at the top of their agenda, being nice to the United States or Europe. There's also an issue in terms of how it's moved in an Islamic direction, concerns about where that's leading, as well as a very strong push for what some call an Ottoman foreign policy. And that's, I think, a long-term issue for the US and Europe in many of these areas. The whole idea of overturning the Treaty of Lausanne and redoing boundaries, which this is what Erdogan wants. Now, he's not the only one who talks in these terms. The kind of a blue Mediterranean strategy, wanting to essentially grab control over Eastern Mediterranean waters, an agreement signed with one of the governments of Libya to try to give greater access to the sea to Turkey, cutting everyone else out. All of these are issues that are not just with Erdogan. These are ones that the US, Europeans, Israel, Cyprus, everyone in the region has to be thinking about, that are likely to be with us whatever happens in the elections coming in May. And I think this, this is a very real challenge for us. And of course, as I mentioned, there's an awful lot going on. It's certainly easy to think about, let's get out of here. But we really have to look ahead and ask, I think, some very serious questions. One of which is the
Doug,
future of.
we're losing the audio a little bit. At least I am. I don't know if others.
Okay,
okay, Mike? Go ahead, continue, sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. So I think one issue is American base presence in Turkey and the presence of nuclear weapons, which could be held hostage by Turkey. That's one that this administration, I think, needs to address. The issue of NATO membership for Turkey is one that, going forward, there's no obvious way to kick Turkey out, but I think the allies have to really start asking some very serious questions about can Turkey be trusted? And if you look at its behavior with Finland and Sweden, one can argue whether or not NATO should expand, but its processes shouldn't be held hostage to domestic Turkish politics, which Erdogan is quite willing to do so. The question of how Turkey deals with a NATO member of Greece, deals with a country that it occupies, Cyprus. These are ones which, again, this administration does need to deal with. The reality is that Greece is a far more solid ally than Turkey. That would suggest at least greater support from other NATO members against Turkey over its violations of territorial waters and air. And again, threats to go to war with Greece. This, one would think, would bring forth some condemnation out of Washington and in other members. Issues of the Black Sea access. I mean, all of these, I think, are very important. And looking ahead, I think we're going to see a lot of turbulence in the region. Israel is facing real domestic political challenges. Iran, is moving ahead. We've had this deal, just came out with Chinese mediation with Saudi Arabia. Not at all clear how that's going to work out. Will it even survive? Will it be carried forth? Syria remains kind of a catastrophic disaster with no political movement, with both Turkey and Syria suffering in the earthquake, huge humanitarian concerns as well. You take these issues, throw them in along with the issue of Russia, Ukraine, Black Sea. This is going to be a very volatile region. So I think we're looking at an awful lot of challenges. The opportunities are going to be harder to discern, and this requires attention from policymakers in Washington. They can't push this off. They've got to address it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Doug. And before I give the floor to Dr. Rubin, just to remind our audience, they can submit a question for our panelists via the Q&A chat on your screens. Dr. Rubin.
Hey, thank you very much. First of all, just let me start off by offering condolences with regard to the horrendous train wreck and so forth and all the reverberations for that. Look, I mean, I think it's pretty clear, me being at American Enterprise Institute, Doug, with Cato, that there's not much we actually agree on. The Eastern Mediterranean is an exception. And I feel very, very confident that if we had someone from the left-leaning Center for American Progress, for example, they would just as enthusiastically say that they are in agreement. And that is symbolic of just how much the strategic environment has changed. The Eastern Mediterranean and the understanding of its importance to the United States happily is one of those issues that no longer is, or that is simply not a partisan football. The United States is at its strongest when we work across party lines, when we work across ideological lines. And when it comes to Greece, Cyprus, and the Eastern Mediterranean, this is one issue where we can do that. And this is one of the reasons why the White House, and I happen to think they do this knowingly, when they talk about offering Turkey F-16s, they know behind the scenes that they're not really going to take a political hit for it because they can blame Congress in its entirety, both Republicans and Democrats. Back about 13 years ago, when Namık Tan was Turkey's ambassador to the United States, he used to be Turkey's ambassador to Israel and also Turkey's foreign ministry spokesman. He looked at the Turkish Congressional Caucus and argued that its numbers, which at that point were, I think, slightly north of 200, were a metric for the influence of Turkey inside Washington. Today, the Turkish caucus doesn't publish its true numbers, but I happen to look at the list and they have fewer congressmen willing to attach their name to Turkey than members of the Turkish algae caucus. I'm not joking there. There are more congressmen involved in dealing with affairs of algae along our coastlines than there are with those who want to lend their names to promoting a Turkish-American relations against the backdrop of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now, both Doug and I have dealt with AHI before and have been on panels together. And there's always the danger that we're going to be sound like broken records saying many of the same things, but in this case, I don't think we will. 2023 truly will be a pivotal year. Look, American sense of history sometimes doesn't extend back more than 10 years. But in portions in the outside world, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Turkey, the sense of history is much deeper. And so Turks, especially Recep Tayyip Erdogan, are very, very cognizant that this year marks the 100th anniversary of modern Turkey. Now, it's fair to say that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was the most consequential Turkish leader. But I think there's no longer any debate that Recep Tayyip Erdogan is the second most consequential Turkish leader over the course of that century. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan has every ambition to supplant Ataturk in this regard. Presiding over the 100th anniversary of Turkey is an opportunity to do that, to basically declare a new republic, to have further constitutional revisions and so forth. Now, I happen to know the Turkish opposition figures, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. It's not simply that many among his left of center party are anti-American, but Kemal has the charisma of a moss-covered rock. And therefore, while he's used his monopoly over power and his longevity, every Turkish political party is like its own private dictatorship. Political leaders in Turkey don't resign when they lose an election. They just double down and lose another election. So we've got a situation where, because he has put himself in this position to challenge Erdogan, as opposed to the much more charismatic and younger mayor of Istanbul or mayor of Ankara, we've got a real situation where Recep Tayyip Erdogan may be able to pull this out even without cheating. And make no mistake, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, it's projecting our own wishful thinking upon Turkey to believe that somehow Recep Tayyip Erdogan is going to voluntarily step down, that he's going to allow himself to go into elections and abide by the results. Either there will be a state of emergency or there will be massive cheating. But sometimes people who truly don't believe in democracy, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of course, famously said democracy is like a streetcar, you ride as far as you need and then you step off, to project our own sense of electoral duty and accountability onto Turkey is a massive mistake. Now, let me talk about a few other things. A week and a half ago, I came back from Iraq, and I'll be leaving for Iraq in just a couple days again for the 20th anniversary of the war. When I was in Iraq, I was just a couple weeks ago, I was talking to some senior officials, and they were, of course, talking about energy. This is Iraq, where 90% of the income happens with regard to gas. There is, of course, this arbitration judgment that is likely going to go against Turkey to the tune of more than $20 billion in favor of Iraq. If you guys haven't been tracking that, if you haven't been following that, back in the 1970s, Iraq and Turkey had signed an agreement which basically stated that all the oil that transits pipelines from Iraq into Turkey belongs to the government of Iraq until, of course, it gets to Turkey. Because Turkey had made separate agreements with Iraqi Kurds, this violated that, and we have an arbitration agreement against Turkey in favor of Iraq. This is a blow. The United States is trying to mediate this before the official announcement of the judgment against Turkey. The point of this is sometimes we can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. We have two problems when it comes to our diplomacy with Turkey. Number one, there is a belief within the State Department that if only we bring Turkey into the big tent, for example, into East Med partnerships and so forth, that somehow that can advance peace. I would argue, and Doug talked about the problems we have with regard to NATO and Turkey's attitudes toward it, that it would be a horrendous mistake to empower Turkey by bringing it into any arrangement prior to Turkey agreeing to the principles of that arrangement in the first place. Better to exclude Turkey and use membership in any sort of arrangement as an incentive for Turkey to change its behavior beforehand and contractually be obliged to maintain that good behavior. The other thing I worry about is I had some senior officials, and I can't say their names in a public setting, say that energy envoy Amos Hochstein came through and was telling them that, in this case, Iraqi Kurds, that they should be sending their oil through Turkey in order to help generate revenue, in order to basically better integrate the region. The problem with this is there is an Iraqi Supreme Court ruling which rules against Iraqi Kurds' oil law. And so I went back and, you know what, the State Department position is that the Kurds shouldn't be doing this. So we have the traditional situation that we've seen in the past with people like Matt Bryza, in other contexts, Zalmay Khalilzad and others, where people freelance in a way in which it seems that they're setting themselves up for their post-US government career. It's a very, very negative trend, and it's something that everyone in the region needs to be wary of. Let's just say that we have to trust but verify. If a US government official who has spent his entire career working on Turkey or working in energy decides to make a statement, it behooves everyone in the region not to accept that as the position of the United States until they confirm it is, because unfortunately, sometimes the sausage making inside Washington leads to an environment where some people believe that they can individually benefit. Now, when it comes to NATO, Doug is better positioned to talk about this, but I was recently in Brussels, and we were talking about this issue. Turkey and people who talk about the importance of Turkey to NATO will oftentimes say, look, Turkey has the second most men under arms of any NATO country, and that's true. But when I was talking to a military planner who was involved in Libya, what they pointed out is when we have a NATO operation or any sort of multilateral operation, let's just say NATO operation, what happens is you have a meeting in Brussels where all the various representatives of all the various governments will determine what they're willing to donate to that mission. So when we look at Turkey's men under arms, that's theoretical only. What matters in terms of influence inside NATO and the diplomatic benefits which people get from the size of their army, what matters isn't the size of the army, it matters what you're willing to do with it, what you're willing to contribute to NATO missions. And in this case, I would argue that it's time to stop giving Turkey the influence of an army of conscripts, which it doesn't believe that it will ever utilize for the purposes of NATO. We're allowing Turkey to basically draw too many benefits. Now, Doug, who brought up the 100th anniversary of Lausanne, and that's, of course, another reason why 2023 is so important. And I don't mean this as a backhanded compliment by any means. I say it sincerely. Doug has a reputation in Washington for being very, very level-headed, very, very responsible with what he says. Perhaps sometimes I have a reputation for being less responsible with what I say. And what I would argue is what frustrates me, and I'm not saying this tongue in cheek, I'm actually quite serious about it. When it comes to the 100th anniversary of Lausanne and some of Erdogan's irredentism, revanchism, and so forth, what drives me nuts is how often the United States and the State Department act as if they are responding by chat GBT or whatever it is, the new, whatever the diplomatic mad libs are. I would argue that we have to go on the intellectual offensive. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, you want to revise borders? Okay, let's talk about Izmir. What I would argue is that the best defense is a good offense in this case. And if Turkey wants to continue talking about revision of borders, let's make it very, very clear to Turkey that the revision of borders aren't necessarily going to be in its favor. I think that's actually key. And sometimes I just don't believe the State Department is aggressive enough and creative enough in this sort of issue. The last point I'll say before we go to Q&A is we talked about in the introduction about Greece, about Cyprus, about their military roles and so forth. Certainly there's an energy role there. Unfortunately, with the State Department deep sixing or trying to deep six East Med, again, I'm not sure its motives were correct in this. What they're also doing is undercutting the investment in hydrogen and so forth. Let's put that aside for now. When it comes to the military, look, Turkey, like I just said, has the second most men under arms of any NATO state. But we've been through this before when it came to Israel against the backdrop of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel is never going to be able to match the sheer manpower of the various Arab states. And so what the Pentagon decided across administrations, across parties, was that there would be a qualitative military edge guaranteed for Israel. That the Arab states at the height of the Cold War might have the quantity, but Israel would be guaranteed to have the quality. I would argue that the same thing is true when it comes that we need to institutionalize that concept now, so long as Turkey's behavior is what it is. We already see the beginnings of this with Greece getting the F-35 and Turkey being offered the F-16. And by the way, I don't think that should be linked. I mean, Greece should get the F-35s because they need it. It shouldn't be dependent on F-16s for Turkey. But when it comes to Cyprus as well, where Turkey has built an illegal drone base, we should be providing Cyprus with the means to counter those drones in a way that is qualitatively superior. So this is what I think we need to get our head around as we look forward. We've got to stop reacting and be proactive. How do we want the East Mediterranean to be in the year 2035, in the year 2050? It's certainly going to remain just as important because energy needs aren't going away. Hopefully, Turkey will be part of a productive role in that in the future, should they change. But as Doug said, and I agree with him again, given the incitement that has impacted that we've seen over the past 20 years, given that more than 30 million Turks have gone through the education system under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, I'm worried that this conflict is this tension, this problem is going to continue for quite some time to come. I hope I've been provocative enough. Let's we can go back and forth. If I provoke Doug in any way, certainly we can discuss. And I see there's a bunch of questions, so let me turn the floor back over.
Well, look, thank you very much both for those insightful comments and for being provocative, if you will. I enjoy that. I've been called that, and I will continue to be as such. Look, one of the things we get challenged with sometimes here at the American Hellenic Institute is always trying to talk about Greece and Cyprus within the context of what they're doing in a positive way. They're doing a lot of things in a positive way, and Greece and Cyprus has done a tremendous job in terms of their bilateral relationship with the United States. That's increased dramatically. It's been proven over the course of the last couple of years, and especially Greece. That relationship has continued to grow, especially with the advent of Alexandroupolis. And I was there in November, and I was at the port of Alexandroupolis, and the ship, the Endurance, was there, and there had to be about 100, U.S. Abrams tanks there, and a bunch of other armored personnel vehicles, all heading north. They wouldn't tell me where, but you can only guess where they were heading to. Be it as it may, it's just a tremendous amount of military assets and defense cooperation with Greece. However, as much as all that is true, we still can't help but talk about the friend NATO, a member Turkey, and the problems that it causes in the region. So most of our discussions, happen to be along what Turkey is doing and not necessarily what Greece is doing. And that comes back to the State Department, and discussions we have at the State Department all come along the lines of, well, Turkey, It's a very complicated partner. There's a lot of things that we deal with them. Doug, you certainly highlighted that in the beginning of all the areas of where Turkey is involved, not necessarily in a positive way, and regarding support of U.S. interests. But nonetheless, the position is, we got to deal with them in a certain way. We don't want to embarrass them openly by criticizing them openly, but we do have these discussions behind the scenes, and we understand where this is all going. But this carrot approach, and you kind of alluded to it, Michael, that it cannot be the carrot approach. The carrot approach continues to permeate and continues to, and we like to use the word appeasement. We view this as a lot of appeasement for whatever reason regarding the State Department, that they're not willing to fully come out, okay, and to attack Turkey openly on a lot of these things that ultimately do affect U.S. interest in the area. Is it a situation of kicking the can down the road? Not on my watch. Let me get through my assistant secretary position or my, DAS position, and let the guys down the street down in a few years worry about it, which I think is a very dangerous approach, because you can't keep kicking the can down the road. Look at Cyprus, 49 years, and it continues to be occupied by Turkey, a NATO country, occupying a member of the European Union, as Doug said. I mean, can you talk about a little bit more as to what is this thinking at the State Department? Is it still the real politique of Henry Kissinger of 74 that continues to really drive what the issue regarding Turkey is and how we deal with Turkey? Unmute. Unmute.
Michael, we can't hear you. Still muted.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute.
Still can't
I
hear
could
you.
hear that. I was just asking who you were addressing.
Well, I mean, it's a question to both of you, but you can, each one of you can, answer.
I would just say very quickly that sometimes the State Department can be very, very good at tree counting, but very, very bad at forest spotting. And while there was a reason why Henry Kissinger, all those decades ago, decided that he was going to diminish the importance of regional expertise among foreign service officers in favor of a broader rotation, so that there wasn't as much incidence of localitis. At the same time, this leads to a diminishment of institutional knowledge, and that's something where I would hope that in the future, the National Security Council might have greater influence. At the very least, you're absolutely right. 49 years of occupation in Cyprus suggests that there's a major problem. And if you ask any diplomat, this is just the way it's always been. There's a lack of imagination there. You're absolutely right. Many deputy assistant secretaries, many assistant secretaries simply just want to kick the can down the road. The U.S. government can be suffocating. They don't want to have the aggravation there. One other aspect I would just say, and I mean, I'd be curious about your thought on this. Personnel is policy, but it's not just a matter of individuals. I would argue that the State Department is skewed in favor of Turkey simply by the sheer number of personnel involved on Eastern Mediterranean issues who are assigned to Turkey. There needs to be some fundamental revision and reassignment so that the Turkey desk isn't 2 or 3 times the size of some of the other desks, especially because the State Department too often runs by consensus. I tend to be opposed to consensus, and for the simple reason, imagine that you have a hornet's nest. There's 2 good ways to deal with the hornet's nest. One is to leave it alone. The other way is to get rid of it. But the last thing you want to do is compromise down the middle and sit underneath it, lightly tapping it with a stick. And unfortunately, that seems to be what we do too much. I'd rather have a decision made and be wrong than constantly try to split things down the middle. And that's just guaranteed to be ineffective.
Doug, you want to comment?
Yeah, I think there's an obvious reason why we have to talk about Turkey. I mean, the U.S. has lots of complaints about its allies, and we can list them. European, Middle Eastern, Asian, all of them do things that irritate the U.S., sometimes fairly substantially crosswise to the U.S. But Turkey is the one formal ally, treaty ally that we have that, as far as I can tell, is constantly crosswise at some very fundamental interests. So this is not a new problem. This is an issue. I mean, you go back a half century in terms of Cyprus, potential conflict with Greece. I mean, these are long-standing issues. And then more recently, its role in the Middle East, its foreign policy and other issues. I think the problem, there are a couple of elements here, one of which is the historic sense that, well, it's an important anchor for the southeastern, the part of the alliance, contra, the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And given the government that it had at that time, very much influenced by the military, a very different kind of political cast, you could argue that was true, but that's gone. I mean, that's history that has no relevance today. And I think there's a certain overhang of that people are used to thinking of Turkey as somehow this important security asset. I mean, if you have access to Incirlik Air Base, but if you can't actually use it, I mean, what are you getting out of it? I mean, how is this a benefit if in fact you can't use it in ways that you think are necessary for your security? And I think the second problem is, especially at the State Department, is people want to believe that Turkey is what it should be, right? It should be, a democratic Islamic state. It should be a model for the region. It should be America's, kind of ally at a cross point. And that's all very nice, fine and good, but we're not there. So we have to see Turkey plain and respond to it as it is. And there, I think the problems are very deep and they go beyond Erdogan. So we need, and I think the Mike's right, that part of this is anybody on the desk in the State Department, there's a tendency you want your relationship to go well. I mean, it's far better in many ways if you're going to be representing Turkey, dealing with Turkish issues, you want a positive out of that. So I think there's a natural tendency of people to try to put a more positive spin on it, that you want better relationships, you want to work with folks in Turkey, et cetera. It's just a lot harder to go in constantly saying the folks we're talking to are really screw ups. We've got to do something serious with them. That's not a message people like.
Regarding Incirlik, a lot of times we have these internal discussions. I think you kind of, alluded to it, that it's certainly not an important facility for our interest there today. And if you can't use it, as was the case during the Iraqi war, within the first, phase of the war, they did not allow any sorties to originate out of that base. Only after the Iraqi Air Force was neutralized did they allow sorties, and I think it was 1 out of 20 originated from Incirlik. So the point today is, would you advocate that we remove our military presence from Incirlik and all assets we have there, including what they claim to be as many as 50 nuclear weapons?
Well, I certainly would bring the nukes out. I mean, and I would do it over time. You don't want to make a big deal of it. We shouldn't have those there. I just don't see any reason to have that kind of a weapon that could be held hostage by somebody who has, I think, grandiose ambitions and is certainly not operating towards American interests. And I think it makes a lot of sense for the U.S. to think of contingency plans, to be ready to move the rest of our forces if we have to think about the alternatives, what we would do if we didn't have access to that base. We don't want to be in a position where we can be held hostage by an ally that does not behave like an ally.
And I'll go a little bit further to that, actually, and state, I think that we should close the Incirlik base. What I worry about, I agree with everything Doug just said, but there's a bureaucratic tendency within the United States to want to protect assets, again, to count the trees, not see the forest. And so when we look at Incirlik in Turkey, or for that matter, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, there's a tendency to treat these bases as a get out of jail free card for the actions of the regimes which host them. We just have to be much more cognizant of that dynamic and not fall into it. Unfortunately, when it comes to Turkey, I'm afraid that for too long we have fallen into it. And the difference is, while in the past all our eggs were in one basket, they no longer need to be so. With Alexandropolis, with what we have in Constanza, Romania, and then with LHDs, what you can think of landing helodecks, and what you can think of as the small aircraft carriers that can fly the F-35s, the Ospreys, and so forth. It means that we don't need to be as dependent on Incirlik as militarily we once were 20 years ago. And therefore, rather than simply maintain the base because we've always maintained the base, I would actually look at in an age where we have limited resources, I would much rather have our military infrastructure be geared to the situation of the future rather than the situation as it was 40, 50 years ago.
Regarding the upcoming elections in Turkey, and you mentioned obviously, you know, the six opposition parties that, you know, have come together under I can't pronounce this gentleman's name, but Kılıçdaroğlu, is, given this scenario, given the earthquakes and building code violations of which supposedly over 50% were under Erdogan's administration, and the economy, so many of the domestic problems that, you know, that Erdogan face, is, if all things are equal in terms of the elections. Now, I know you said that chances are he could win without having to cheat, but isn't this really a time where potentially he could lose? And if he feels at some point moving forward, if things get worse for him, especially as these things continue with the, you know, with the earthquake stuff, especially continues to play out and more things come to the surface, and where he might feel more squeezed, that he will do the traditional modus of operandi, and that's create an external issue, which in this case, the one that would be the negative beneficiary, in my opinion, would be Cyprus, most likely. Your comments, both of you, on your thoughts on that?
You want to start, Mike?
Sure. I mean, I would, Nick, I would say that I agree with you. The only thing I'm unaware of is whether it would be Cyprus, whether it would be an unmanned Greek island in the Aegean, whether, I mean, according to the presidency of Iraq, Turkey now has 68 different outposts inside that country, as far south as Diyala, which is pretty far south, far more south than Iraqi Kurdistan. The fact of the matter is there is no shortage of external enemies which Erdogan can act upon in order to rally people around the flag. It's a very, very dangerous situation. And this is why I think, again, I'll just double down, the United States needs to play offense rather than defense. We need to be proactive rather than reactive. And we've got, I mean, one of the things I think, by the way, the Biden administration did masterfully was declassify intelligence very, very rapidly ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to take the wind out of Russia's sails, to make clear what was happening and why it was happening, to neutralize any sort of false flag narrative. I'd argue that we need to do the exact same thing when it comes to Turkey. Rather than coddle it as a NATO member, we need to expose what Erdogan is doing behind the scenes to, again, show that we will use the power of our intelligence, the power of our knowledge, and so forth in order to prevent him from achieving his aims. And by the way, just one final point before I turn the floor back over to Doug, is that when it comes to Turkey's intelligence, one thing which worries me tremendously is years of NATO partnership have meant that we too often are willing to accept Turkish intelligence at face value. We have seen in recent decades what a mess Turkish intelligence can be and how politically polluted it is. We need to not just look at Turkish intelligence being provided to us now with a healthy dose of skepticism. We need to actively audit the intelligence we have had from Turkey going back years, decades, to try to separate the wheat from the chaff, to basically ask whether this is something we should believe because it's Turkey, or whether this is some sort of nonsense. I mean, nonsense. It's an intelligence scandal to a huge degree, which unfortunately isn't being addressed.
Doug?
Yeah, Erdogan certainly knows that under normal circumstances, he cannot rely on a fair election. I mean, the last time they had serious elections, of course, he lost, his party lost, the AKP lost several cities, including Ankara, and they lost Istanbul twice. I mean, he forced a rerun of the election, and it was a massive turn out and defeat the second go around. People didn't appreciate, the overt nature of his interference. So from his standpoint, especially given everything going on, culpability and the extra damage out of the earthquake and the utter economic mess they are going through, I don't see how he would normally win. I think if there's one contingency I would suspect would be most likely, it's probably Kurds. Because not only is the issue of can you create a foreign crisis, there's a legal case pending before the High Court over the Kurdish party, which they could outlaw the party. And depending on the timing, they could outlaw the party after the candidates have been chosen. Not at all clear how they would get back into the parliamentary elections. So this, if you put those two together, he could create an Kurdish crisis of some sort, whether it be Syrian Kurds or others, and tie that to the fact that the court is outlawing the party, which he claims is in league with terrorists. I think that would fit very well, where he could transform the electoral system through a national crisis and use folks who've long been essentially the scapegoats for the nationalists in Turkey for quite some time. So I have trouble imagining him being willing to walk away because at this stage, he's in far too deep. That to give up power means that he and all of his cronies would be subject to legal prosecution. I think those around him, essentially won't let him walk away, that he represents not just himself, but a whole party filled with cronies and others who've made a lot of money off of his rule.
I'm going to give a two-finger addition to what Doug just said, because this is something that I've been in discussion with the Kurds on. And just so for the sake of clarity, I agree with Doug on this. The Kurdish party goes by the acronym HDP. The issue is Doug had referred to how, or Nick, perhaps it was you, how there were 6 opposition parties who were coming together to choose a unified candidate, and they chose the leader of the center-left party, the CHP. Then you have Erdogan. The Kurds have said that they were not going to join the regular opposition. They oppose Erdogan, but they oppose the party of Ataturk for the same reason. What they have been hoping is that if neither party is able to get a majority, then they would be in the catbird seat with regard to any sort of runoff, with regard of telling people whom to vote, and they could get into an almost Israel-style sort of extortion racket, for a political extortion racket, for lack of a better term, in order to sell their votes to whoever would then, in order to play kingmaker. So that's one of the reasons why Erdogan is so worried about what the Kurds might do and whether he can kneecap them, because they are everyone's protest vote. And they could deny Erdogan and his opposition a majority, and Erdogan is afraid of what the cost of that would be, both in terms of prestige, but also in terms of political power. I apologize for jumping in, Doug, if you disagree with that assessment.
That's fine.
Okay.
No, that's a good addition. No, thanks, Michael.
Let me ask another question here on Cyprus. Now, we got a couple of questions up here, but I think some of this was answered within the context of this back and forth we've had. Cyprus just had an election as a new president. High on his agenda is the restart of negotiations to reunify the island. Well, I don't know how you do that when, Mr. Tartar, the Turkish Cypriot leader, backed by Turkey, says two-state solution, and there's no backing down from this. We feel the United States has a role to play in terms of moving this process forward. I'd like to hear from you. What role do you think the United States can play, or should have, but more importantly, can play today in terms of trying to get to a situation where it can move the process forward to have negotiations regarding the reunification of Cyprus?
Well, to me, the big challenge is Erdogan. That I do not see the northern Cypriots, agreeing to anything that Ankara does not agree to, and I don't see Erdogan as being one willing to give up a dominant Turkish presence on the island. That I think he is quite happy to basically have 37% of the landmass, to have Turkish troops stationed on Cyprus that, the question is, how does the US move him off that? And then that joins a long list of, well, how does the US convince him to kind of fill in the blank on all these other issues that we've been discussing? So unfortunately, I think if Turkish Cypriots, or if the folks in the north, how best to refer to them, if they were free agents, I think one could have a serious negotiation, because I have to imagine that people living in the northern part of the island today have a very different conception of what they want than they might have wanted in July of 1974. Unfortunately, I don't see a change in the larger power. And I just don't know how to get around the blocking power at the moment of Erdogan.
I would just add to that, before I cited the Izmir example, and I would say the same thing with regard to this problem. If Turkey wants to fundamentally change the status quo, it needs to understand that that is not going to work in its favor. And so rather than allow the Northern Cypriots, or in reality, I agree with Doug, Erdogan himself, to shift the discussion as to independence and a two-state solution, I would simply reopen and relitigate previous issues that ultimately led to the state's division. De facto division. And when it comes to the only caution I would note, and I don't think Doug and I disagree with this, but I do think it needs to be highlighted at every opportunity, is when we're talking about Turkish Cypriots, we've got to differentiate
The settlers.
between the settlers and the legitimate Turkish Cypriots. And we've got to stop giving the settlers any sort of voice, because frankly, the settlers, especially in recent years, are much more radical. And the way I look at it, they are undermining the democracy there of northern potential democracy of Northern Cyprus, at least the willingness or the ability of Turkish Cypriots, legitimate Turkish Cypriots, to have a voice. They are an impediment. Basically, I would just say they're completely illegitimate. And I'd go further. I think that Turkey, using the settlers, are in the midst of creating a cultural genocide against Turkish Cypriots, who traditionally, as in many island countries, have a much more moderate outlook than what is being imposed upon them. Well, again, we've got to see the forest, not the trees.
Well, again, without a doubt, right now the Turkish Cypriots, probably an extremely small minority in the occupied part of Cyprus. It's really difficult to tell what the illegal settlers are in terms of the real number, but some figures have them as high as 500,000, but they probably are at least 200,000, but maybe closer to 500,000. And most recently, we heard accounts of earthquake victims who lost, their homes. Approximately 38,000 were transferred to the occupied part of Cyprus. So he continues to play in this game, which again violates the Geneva Convention. But as a matter of the principles of the violations going back to 74, and we need to be reminded of this, are the same violations of international law. It was an illegal invasion, occupation, and violation of the UN Charter and international law and the rule of law. And those are the exact same violations that occurred in Kuwait and the exact same violations of Russian aggression in Ukraine. We know how the international community reacted regarding Kuwait, the coalition that was developed by the Bush administration at that time, and obviously what's going on now with Ukraine, all rightfully so, in my opinion. You cannot award aggression because others take note and follow suit. But again, Cyprus, 49 years on the cusp of 50 years, same violations, NATO ally, EU country, and no one seems to really give a damn about trying to push hard against somebody that is inside your tent, who's been a beneficiary of billions of US foreign aid over the years, and continues, to enjoy a certain degree of status with US administrations, as we see irresponsibly by the Biden administration wanted to ask for, F-16s and upgrade, packaging and so forth. They may want to use it for political purposes, but at the end of the day, because I'm a little pessimist here. No matter how hard Senator Menendez and others are going to fight, they're going to fight this very hard. I'm just afraid at some point down the road, one of these national security loopholes will come into play that the presidential has at his, at his disposal to be able to try to make a case and to provide these weapons, to Turkey. Because again, it always seems to fall into this pattern. No matter what Turkey does, ultimately they always seem to come out on the other side, coming out clean. And it's just a concern, and I just don't see it changing as much.
And Nicosia is the only divided capital in the world that I'm aware of. It's certainly the only divided capital left in Europe. I mean, people were horrified by the division of Berlin. Well, we have a city that's been divided for 49 years. I mean, you go there, you see it. You see the line in between. And it really is shocking to see that. And basically,
Doug, you froze up on us.
I'm still here.
Anything you want to say?
No, I agree with Doug. It is shocking. And again, when we have collective short-term memory difficulties within the Washington strategic community, it's a problem. When our sense of what is normal is the way it was 2 years ago, that ultimately is something which we need to correct. Again, if ordinary Foreign Service officers aren't able to address this, this is a job to occur at a higher political level. What I would also say is that we've got to start calling Erdogan's bluff. I've talked about this in terms of the Armenian genocide. I've talked about this in terms of the PKK, even though that hasn't happened yet, that for years we didn't do what was right and recognize the Armenian genocide because we were afraid of how Turkey would react. Finally, the Biden administration, to its credit, recognized the genocide. And you know what? Basically crickets. Frankly, many countries in the world recognize the Armenian genocide. We called Erdogan's bluff. There is nothing he could do. I would argue that the same thing is true if we recognize the PKK, which, by the way, is a group that has never killed any Americans, that has evolved. It's no longer, I mean, at best, it's Marxist light. But when I look at what they have achieved in northeastern Syria, it's pretty astounding. It's pretty amazing. And if we would stop being intimidated by Turkey and simply recognize it, what could Turkey do? We've got to stop looking at countries like Turkey when we're sitting in Washington and believing that they are our equals. We should not be dealing with Ankara as equals. If Erdogan wants to play his games as the superpower or a leading superpower, we need to be very, very clear with what the consequences of that are. And I would just say, as we wait for Doug to get back on, if he's able, when Pastor Andrew Brunson was arrested, relatively minor steel tariffs brought Erdogan to his knees. Basically, when it comes to Erdogan, we need to recognize the Sultan has no clothes.
But to that point, though, what really moved the needle a lot with Pastor Brunson was the fact that you had, a large base here of the Christian-based community here that was able to engage 3 U.S. senators and made a big groundswell support that created pressure on the White House and Trump himself, pretty much, called on Erdogan and said, you either release him or I'm going to destroy your economy. I'm paraphrasing, but I believe it was something to that effect. So there was a lot of pressure that was developed to be able to release Pastor Brunson. And unfortunately, that's what it takes, to move the needle here in Washington.
But Nick, I mean, on one hand, I agree with you. On the other hand, there's absolutely no reason in my mind why a State Department, why a Secretary of State, or why a national security advisor, let alone the President of the United States, couldn't likewise make the same sort of statement. And I don't care whether they're Democrat or Republican. Unfortunately, and I'm being partisan now, or actually being more of a history nerd, I kind of look at Tony Blinken as being the rebirth of Frank Kellogg in terms of sometimes naivete in the face of dictatorship.
No, I hear you. I mean, we need to come strong. Listen, Doug is not able to come back on, and we've, well, there is Doug. Doug, good to have
Sorry
you
about
back
that.
on.
The internet went out for some reason, so it took a few minutes to get it back on.
Look, we're gonna wrap it up here. I'm gonna make one closing comment. Michael, to a degree, basically did. You want to just say anything in terms of last word, Doug, before I close it up?
Sure. I'll just return to the theme that the issues dealing with the Eastern Mediterranean are important, that we cannot let them go by the wayside. There's an awful lot going on that keep people in Washington busy, domestic as well as foreign. But the Eastern Mediterranean today, it's tied to the Middle East, it's tied to NATO, it's tied to Ukraine, it's tied to North Africa. These are all issues that are important, and Turkey's a critical part of this. And we need to finally respond to Turkey as it is, not as we wish it was or how it might have been. We've got to deal with it as a reality today, and it's quite a challenge for the United States and America's allies.
Well, we'll leave it at that, and just allow me to say, that this Secretary of State, in his confirmation hearing, said Turkey is a NATO ally that doesn't behave as a NATO ally. Well, certainly, in my opinion, nothing has changed during the time of his confirmation hearings till to this day, and if anything, it's gotten worse as it relates, to what we've seen in terms of how they involve with each other in the relationship with Russia, and obviously the problems they're causing for Finland and Sweden regarding NATO accession. Then you also have Mr. Blinken referring most recently in that you have to deal with countries in terms of the aggression of Russia, because if you don't, well, then you provide an opportunity for others to view this and to say, well, hey, if they can do it and no one reacted, well, we can do the same thing. Couldn't agree more. But in this world of this situation where this little phrase has developed, the rules-based international order, the rule-based international order. Well, we can't be selective in the rules-based international order, because without the rule of law, to support the international rules-based order, there is no rules-based international order. And nowhere, at least in our universe, is this more focused in terms of what's going on in Cyprus. And everything that I just prefaced applies, to the Republic of Cyprus. And we cannot be hypocritical in the eyes of the world in terms of Cyprus when we say it for other countries. We've got to be able to say it for Cyprus, and especially when it involves one of our own, a NATO Turkish ally. So, and we also remind whenever we can, Mr. President Biden, in a letter that he wrote to this organization in 1989, and I'm paraphrasing here, it was a long paragraph, but it related to Cyprus, he said, until every Turkish military soldier is removed from Cyprus, they should not be part of the international community. Joe Biden, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said this in 1989, and I submit to the president, nothing has changed since 1989, and if anything, things have gotten worse regarding proclaiming of two-state solutions, proclaiming of opening the Varosha area in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and talk of half of the Aegean and rockets that can target Athens, ecumenical patriarchy and religious freedom. We can go on and on and on. These are the things that we will continue to focus on, and I hope the administration and those who are looking at policies continue to do so and don't kick the can down the road. I want to thank both of you for your incredible insights in terms of the area of the Eastern Mediterranean and what you brought to this discussion today. This was very enlightening, and I certainly appreciate the very poignant comments without skirting any of the discussion here today. It's refreshing, it's needed, and that's what needs to take place in these discussions, and they need to be on the record and not off the record. So I certainly appreciate this today. Just to remind our audience that we'll come back with you on the 28th of March when we will host our annual Congressional Salute to Greek Independence Day. Once again, we're going to do it virtually, and hopefully next year we'll do it live and in person up on Capitol Hill like we used to do. Until then, I also want to thank James H. Lagos, who continues to be a sponsor of these presentations. And I want to thank Vimo Theophanopoulos and Yola Pakchanian and Elias Yerasulis of our staff for always their support of everything we do, and especially regarding these Zoom presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you once again. I thank our panelists. I appreciate it very much, and we look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.